No one knows what became of Sparta's bastards, but even the Spartans feared them. Sparta remembered its warriors. It remembered the shields that never broke, the men who marched into death singing, the laws carved in stone and blood. It remembered Thermopylae, Leuctra, the agoge that turned boys into weapons. It remembered everything it wanted to remember. But it did not remember the children born in the shadows, the ones who carried Spartan blood but no Spartan name. The bastards. No one knows what became of them. The scrolls say nothing. The monuments are silent. But even Sparta feared what they might become. The wind moves differently over abandoned places. It carries voices that were never recorded, names that were never spoken aloud, stories that died in the throats of those who lived them. And if you listen carefully, in the space between what history says and what history hides, you can still hear them. The forgotten sons, the ones who should not have existed, the ones who became something Sparta never intended. This is their story, or what remains of it. If you are still listening, you are one of the few who believe history is more than what was written by victors and priests. Stay, subscribe, because what you're about to hear was never meant to survive. It was buried deliberately, erased systematically, whispered about only in the dark corners where slaves gathered and spoke in languages their masters did not bother to learn. But silence is not the same as non-existence, and fear, once planted, grows even in the dark. To understand what the bastards became, you must first understand what Sparta was, what it demanded, what it could not tolerate. Sparta was not simply a city. It was a machine designed to produce one thing: warriors. Perfect, obedient, identical warriors who valued death over dishonor, the state over the self, purity over everything else. The law of Lycurgus governed every breath, every word, every coupling. Children belonged to Sparta from the moment of birth. At 7, boys were taken to the agoge, that brutal education where weakness was beaten out and strength was forged through hunger, cold, pain, and the constant presence of death. Only legitimate sons of Spartan citizens could enter the agoge. Only those born of proper marriages, inspected by elders, judged worthy of the city's investment. Blood purity was not merely preferred, it was sacred, it was law. It was the foundation upon which Sparta's supremacy rested. A Spartan warrior was not just trained, he was bred. His lineage mattered as much as his shield arm. His mother's citizenship was as important as his father's courage. This was the theory, this was the law. But war has a way of making theory irrelevant and law impossible to enforce. When Spartan armies marched out for campaigns that lasted months or years, when they conquered cities and took prisoners, when they camped in foreign lands surrounded by foreign women, nature asserted itself in ways that Lycurgus had not accounted for. Or perhaps he had accounted for them and simply chose not to write those provisions down, believing that some problems would solve themselves through silence and shame. They did not solve themselves. They multiplied. After every major campaign, after every victory that brought slaves and spoils back to Laconia, there were children. Children with grey eyes and auburn hair. Children with the broad shoulders and strong bones of their warrior fathers. Children who looked unmistakably Spartan, but who were born to mothers who were helots, captives, foreigners, slaves. Children who existed in a legal and social void that Sparta had no proper category for. They were called nothos when they were called anything at all. Bastards, sons of no one, children of shame. Their mothers tried to hide them at first. The foreign women, the conquered ones, the slaves who had been used by warriors far from home and the eyes of their wives. Some of these women hoped that bearing a child with Spartan blood might improve their status, might earn them recognition or protection. They learned quickly that they were wrong. Spartan society had no interest in acknowledging these children. To do so would be to admit that their warriors had been undisciplined, that their precious purity of blood had been compromised, that the machine had malfunctioned. So the children were ignored, hidden in helot quarters, raised in the fields and workshops where slaves labored, kept out of sight of the proper Spartan families. They grew up watching from a distance as legitimate Spartan boys marched to training, as their own fathers passed them in the street without a glance of recognition, as the city that flowed through their veins rejected them absolutely. Some did not survive infancy. Exposure was common enough even for legitimate children who were born weak or malformed, for bastards, for children whose very existence was an embarrassment. Death came easier still. Some were taken to the apothetae, that chasm in the mountains where unwanted infants were left. Some simply disappeared in the night. Their mothers would wake to find the cradle empty, and no questions would be answered because no questions would be asked. A slave's child, especially one that reminded everyone of an uncomfortable truth, was expendable. But not all of them died. Some survived. Some mothers were clever enough or desperate enough to hide their sons successfully. Some helot families took them in, raised them alongside their own children, taught them to keep their heads down and their mouths shut. Some simply slipped through the cracks of Sparta's rigid social system, growing up in the margins, in the spaces between official categories, learning early that they belonged nowhere and to no one. They grew, and as they grew, they began to understand what they were. Half Spartan, half slave, fully neither. They had the blood of warriors, but were forbidden to train as warriors. They had the features of citizens, but would never be citizens. They were strong, naturally strong, because their fathers had been bred for strength across generations. But that strength had no outlet, no purpose, no recognition. They watched the agog from afar. They saw boys their own age learning to fight, learning to endure, learning to become the most feared warriors in Greece. And they knew, with a certainty that burned like poison in their chests, that they would never be allowed to join them. Some accepted this. They bowed their heads and worked in the fields. They became shepherds, laborers, servants. They learned to make themselves small and invisible, to avoid drawing the attention of their masters, to survive in the only way that slaves could survive. But others did not accept it. Others felt the warrior blood in their veins, demanding expression, demanding recognition, demanding something more than a life spent bent over in helot fields, pretending they were not the sons of the men who owned them. These were the dangerous ones, the ones who could not swallow their rage, the ones who looked at their father's shield on the wall and felt not shame, but fury. The ones who watched Spartan warriors train and thought not, I wish I could be like them, but I am like them, and they refused to see it. These were the ones who began to disappear into the mountains, into the wild places beyond the city's immediate control, into the spaces where Sparta's laws grew thin and other rules began to apply. They taught themselves to fight. It was not the systematic training of the agoge, but it was effective in its own brutal way. They used stones to build strength, trees to practice strikes, each other to learn how bodies break and how to prevent their own from breaking. They stole weapons when they could. A knife from a kitchen, a spear left unattended, an old sword discarded as no longer worthy of a Spartan warrior, but still sharp enough to kill. They learned in secret, in darkness, in silence, because to be caught training would be to be killed. Slaves were not permitted weapons. Half-breeds who imagined themselves warriors were intolerable, but they were not just learning to fight. They were learning something else, something that legitimate Spartan warriors, for all their training, often lacked. They were learning to hate. Pure, focused, undiluted hatred for a system that had created them and then tried to pretend they did not exist. Hatred for fathers who would not acknowledge them. Hatred for a city that valued purity over everything, including basic humanity. This hatred became their discipline, their purpose, their reason to endure the cold and hunger and danger of their training. The agoge broke boys down and rebuilt them as warriors through systematic brutality, but these bastards were already broken. They did not need to be rebuilt. They needed only to be aimed. No one knows exactly how many there were. 20, 50, 100. The records do not exist because no one in power wanted to count them. To count them would be to acknowledge them. To acknowledge them would be to admit the problem. So they remained uncounted, unnamed, officially non-existent. But they existed, and they were growing stronger. The first incidents were small, easy to dismiss. A drunk Spartan warrior found dead on a road outside the city. Bandits, everyone agreed. Helots caused trouble sometimes. It meant nothing. Then another and another, always on dark roads. Always warriors who were alone or nearly alone. Always killed efficiently, with the kind of precision that suggested training. But who would train Helots to kill Spartans? The idea was absurd, so the deaths were explained away, filed under misfortune, used as examples to teach young warriors not to travel alone at night. But the Helots knew. The slaves whispered to each other in their own quarters, in their own languages. They spoke of young men who looked like Spartans, but lived in the mountains. They spoke of training grounds in hidden valleys. They spoke of a group that had no official name, but that everyone called simply the Nothos, the bastards, the rejected sons, the ones who should not exist but somehow did, and the Helots who had suffered under Spartan rule for generations, who had been conquered and enslaved and treated as less than human. The Helots did not report what they knew. Why would they? These bastards were the enemy of their enemy. Let them grow. Let them sharpen themselves. Let them become whatever they were becoming. The Spartans began to notice something was wrong when weapons started disappearing. Not many. One shield here, 2 spears there, a helmet that had been left in a storehouse. These were a warrior society. They kept track of their weapons the way other cities kept track of gold. When the thefts began, they could not be dismissed. Helots stealing weapons meant rebellion. It meant danger. It meant something had to be done. They increased patrols. They punished Helot communities collectively when weapons went missing. They killed suspected thieves. But the thefts continued. Because the thieves were not ordinary Helots. They were trained. They were careful. They moved like shadows, struck like snakes, and vanished before anyone could respond. And they were getting bolder. The first time a Spartan warrior was found dead with his own spear through his chest, the city went silent with shock. This was not how Spartans died. They died in battle, gloriously, surrounded by enemies they had killed. They did not die on their own roads, murdered by thieves who took their weapons and left their bodies as messages. The elders convened, the ephors investigated, Helots were questioned, tortured, killed. But no answers came, or rather, the only answers that came were whispers, rumors, stories about young men who trained in the mountains and who bore the faces of warriors, but the rage of slaves. Then came the night that Sparta truly began to fear. It started with fire, a Helot village on the outskirts of the city's control, a place where slaves worked the fields and caused no trouble, suddenly burning. Not the whole village, just certain houses. Specifically the houses where Spartan overseers slept, the warriors who managed the Helots, who enforced the laws, who walked among the slaves with the confidence of men who had never had reason to fear them. 3 of them died that night. Their throats were cut so precisely that they never had time to scream. Their weapons were taken. Their horses were killed in their stables, silently, efficiently, like a military operation. But it was what was left behind that truly frightened the city. On the wall of one burning house, carved deep into the stone where the fire could not erase it, was a symbol. The lambda, L, the mark of Lacedaemon, the symbol every Spartan warrior wore on his shield. But this lambda was carved upside down, inverted, reversed. A mockery, a rejection, a declaration that said, "We know what we are, we know what you made us, and we are coming." The official records mention none of this. There is no entry in any surviving chronicle about Helot uprisings in this period. No mention of weapons thefts or murdered overseers or burning villages. because to write it down would be to make it real. To make it real would be to admit that Sparta had a problem it could not solve through straightforward violence. These bastards, these nothos, they were not an external enemy that could be fought in open battle. They were an internal wound, a consequence of Sparta's own actions, a reminder that even the most disciplined society cannot fully control what happens when its warriors go to war. The ephors met in secret. They debated solutions. Kill all the bastards. But how do you kill what you cannot find and have never officially acknowledged exists? Kill all the helots. But Sparta's entire economy rested on helot labor. Without slaves, there was no food, no infrastructure, nothing to support the warrior class. Round up all suspicious young men. But which ones? The bastards looked like Spartans. They could hide in plain sight among the helots. They could vanish into the mountains. They were ghosts, dangerous ghosts with training and weapons and nothing left to lose. Some of the older warriors, the ones who had fought in many campaigns and who understood that not all enemies wear foreign armor, began to whisper a different kind of fear. What if the bastards were not alone? What if they had started recruiting, not just other bastards, but helots who were tired of slavery, perioeci who resented their second-class status, anyone with a grievance against Sparta? What if that small group of rejected sons had become the seed of something larger? What if they were organizing in the mountains, training others, building an army in the shadows? There were reports, unconfirmed, denied, but persistent. Helots, returning from mountain pastures, spoke of seeing organized camps, training grounds, men drilling in formation, the lambda symbol, inverted, carved into trees to mark territory. But when Spartan patrols went to investigate, they found nothing. Empty camps, cold fire pits, tracks that led nowhere. It was as if the bastards knew when the warriors were coming and melted away before they arrived, only to return when the danger passed. One warrior, a decorated veteran respected for his tactical mind, proposed a different approach. "They want recognition," he said to the council. "They want to be acknowledged as Spartans. Give them that. Bring them into the agoge. Train them properly. Make them ours, instead of letting them remain our enemies." The proposal was rejected immediately. The elders were horrified. The purity of blood was sacred. To allow bastards into the agoge would pollute everything. It would set a precedent that could destroy Sparta's entire social structure. No, better to have dangerous enemies than to compromise on this. Better to fight shadows in the mountains than to admit that the rigid categories Sparta depended on were not as absolute as they pretended. So the shadow war continued. Small attacks, stolen weapons, dead warriors found on lonely roads. Nothing large enough to be called a rebellion, nothing organized enough to be called an army, but persistent, relentless, a constant reminder that something was out there in the darkness beyond the city walls, something that knew how to fight, something that hated them, something they had created and now could not destroy. The bastards became a story that Spartan mothers told their children to keep them obedient. If you fail in your training, if you show weakness, you will be cast out. And out there are the nothos, the rejected ones who will drag you into the mountains, and you will never be seen again. The story was meant to inspire discipline, but it also revealed the depth of Sparta's fear. They were afraid of their own children, the ones they had refused to claim. Some historians believe the bastards simply dispersed over time, that they became mercenaries, selling their skills to other Greek cities, fighting in wars far from Sparta, living and dying as warriors without a home. Others believe they were eventually hunted down, killed in the mountains by Spartan death squads who operated in secret and left no records of their actions. Still others believe they survived, hidden among the helot population, passing their skills and their rage down through generations, waiting for the day when Sparta would finally be weak enough to destroy. The truth is, no one knows. The bastards vanished from history as completely as if they had never existed, but their absence is louder than most presences. The fact that Sparta never wrote about them, never officially acknowledged them, never celebrated their defeat or mourned their threat, tells us everything we need to know. You do not erase something from the record unless it terrifies you. You do not pretend something never existed unless its existence challenges everything you claim to be. There is one final story, unconfirmed, probably false, but repeated often enough that it has taken on the weight of myth. Years after the first incidents, after the fires and the murders and the stolen weapons, there was a battle, a significant battle. Sparta was fighting one of its endless wars with Argos, or Messenia, or Thebes. The details change depending on who tells the story. What remains constant is this. At a critical moment in the fighting, when the Spartan phalanx was hard-pressed and beginning to falter, a group of warriors appeared. They wore no armor, they carried mismatched weapons, but they fought with the discipline and ferocity of the Agog. They struck the enemy's flank, broke their formation, and vanished before the Spartans could thank them or even see their faces clearly. Later, when the battlefield was being cleared, someone found a shield among the dead. It bore no personal markings, no family emblem, nothing to identify its owner, but carved into the wood, small enough that you had to look closely to see it, was an inverted lambda, a signature, a reminder, a message that said, "We are still here, we are still your sons, and whether you acknowledge us or not, we will fight." The story is almost certainly invented. Warriors do not appear mysteriously on battlefields and then vanish. Shields do not carry secret messages. But the fact that the story exists, that it was told and retold, that it became part of the oral tradition passed down among helots and perioiki and the lower classes of Sparta, tells us something true, even if the specific details are false. It tells us that people wanted to believe in the bastards, wanted to believe that rejected sons could become warriors anyway, wanted to believe that Sparta's rigid categories could be defied, wanted to believe that blood would tell, even when every law and custom said it should not matter. I am old now, far older than most who lived in those times. I am telling you this story from fragments, from whispers, from the things people spoke about only when they thought no one important was listening. I was not a warrior. I was not a bastard. I was barely anything in Sparta's eyes, but I was there. I lived through the time when young men disappeared into the mountains and warriors started dying on dark roads. I saw the fear in people's faces when they spoke the word notos. I heard the stories the helots told their children about the rejected sons who became more dangerous than the legitimate ones. And I know this. Sparta trained its sons to fear nothing. They were taught from childhood that death was preferable to dishonor, that pain was temporary but glory was eternal, that a Spartan warrior could face any enemy without flinching. They marched into impossible battles singing. They held positions long after any sane army would have retreated. They became legends precisely because they seemed to lack the capacity for fear. Yet even they fell silent when someone whispered, "They are back, the sons we never claimed." Even they looked over their shoulders on dark roads. Even they locked their doors at night and kept their weapons close, and wondered if that shadow in the corner was just a shadow or something more. Because the bastards were not just enemies, they were mirrors. They were what Sparta could have been if it had chosen differently. They were proof that the rigid categories and pure bloodlines and sacred laws were all just stories Sparta told itself to justify its cruelty. The bastards existed. They trained, they fought, they killed. They left their mark on Sparta even though Sparta tried desperately to erase them. And then they vanished into the mountains or into history or into the spaces between what is written and what is true. No one knows what became of them. But even now, thousands of years later, their absence haunts the historical record like a wound that never quite healed. If you believe their story should not be forgotten, speak their names in the comments, except we do not know their names. We only know what they were called: Nothos, bastards, the rejected ones, the sons of shadows. So speak that name instead. Let it be remembered, and subscribe so that history cannot bury them again, because they were buried once, deliberately and thoroughly. But some truths have a way of surfacing no matter how deep you dig the grave. This is one of them. The bastards of Sparta lived, they mattered, they were feared. And perhaps in the end, that is the only immortality any warrior truly needs. Not to be loved, not to be honored, but to be remembered. And to know that even your enemies, even the city that rejected you, could not quite forget you were there.